responsibilities of his new command, had fully realized the critical condition of the Army of the Cumberland, and had set out at once for its headquarters to take charge in person of its future operations. On his way to the front, he had telegraphed General Thomas from Louisville to hold Chattanooga at all hazards, to which that intrepid soldier made the famous reply, "I will hold the town till we starve." General Grant had started, the day before the incident I have described, from Bridgeport, a place 30 miles below Chattanooga, where the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad crosses the Tennessee River, and had ridden by way of Walden's Ridge, the only route left open by which communication could be had with the beleaguered town. We had been advised that he was on his way, but hardly expected that he would reach Chattanooga that night, considering the state of the weather, the wretched condition of the roads, or rather bridle paths over the mountain, and the severe injury to his leg, which had been caused by a fall of his horse several weeks before, and from which he was still suffering. When he arrived, he had to be lifted from his saddle and was evidently experiencing much pain, as his horse had slipped in coming down the mountain and had further injured the lame leg. But the general showed less signs of fatigue than might have been supposed after his hard ride of 2 days under such trying circumstances. As soon as General Grant had partaken of a light supper immediately after his arrival, General Thomas had sent for several general officers and most of the members of his staff to come to headquarters, and the room soon contained an exceedingly interesting group. A member of General Thomas's staff quietly called that officer's attention to the fact that the distinguished guest's clothes were pretty wet, and his boots were thoroughly soaked with rain after his long ride through the storm, and intimated that colds were usually no respecters of persons. General Thomas's mind had been so intent upon receiving the commander and arranging for a conference of officers that he had entirely overlooked his guest's travel-stained condition. But as soon as his attention was called to it, all of his old-time Virginia hospitality was aroused, and he at once begged his newly arrived chief to step into a bedroom and change his clothes. His urgings, however, were in vain. The general thanked him politely, but positively declined to make any additions to his personal comfort, except to light a fresh cigar. Afterward, however, he consented to draw his chair nearer to the wood fire which was burning in the chimney-place, and to thrust his feet forward to give his top boots a chance to dry. The extent of his indulgence in personal comfort in the field did not seem to be much greater than that of bluff old Marshal Suvorov, who, when he wished to give himself over to an excess of luxury, used to go so far as to take off one spur before going to bed. At General Grant's request, General Thomas, General William F. Smith, his chief engineer, commonly known in the Army as Baldy Smith, and others, pointed out on a large map the various positions of the troops and described the general situation. General Grant sat for some time as immovable as a rock and as silent as the Sphinx, but listened attentively to all that was said. After a while he straightened himself up in his chair, his features assumed an air of animation, and in a tone of voice which manifested a deep interest in the discussion, he began to fire whole volleys of questions at the officers present. So intelligent were his inquiries and so pertinent his suggestions that he made a profound impression upon everyone by the quickness of his perception and the knowledge which he had already acquired regarding important details of the Army's condition. His questions showed from the outset that his mind was dwelling not only upon the prompt opening of a line of supplies, but upon taking the offensive against the enemy. In this he was only manifesting one of his chief military characteristics, an inborn dislike to be thrown upon the defensive. Even when he had to defend a position, his method of warfare was always that of the offensive-defensive. After talking over a plan for communicating with our base of supplies, or as he called it in his conversation, opening up the cracker line, an operation which already had been projected and for which preliminary steps had been taken, he turned to me as Chief of Ordnance of the Army of the Cumberland and asked, "How much ammunition is there on hand?" I replied, "There's barely enough here to fight one day's battle, but an ample supply has been accumulated at Bridgeport to await the opening of communications." At about 9:30 he appeared to have finished his search after information for the time being, and, turning to a table, began to write telegrams. Communication by wire had been kept open during all the siege. His first dispatch was to General Halleck, the General-in-Chief at Washington, and read, "Have just arrived. I will write tomorrow. Please approve order placing Sherman in command of Department of the Tennessee, with headquarters in the field." He had scarcely begun to exercise the authority conferred upon him by his new promotion when his mind turned to securing advancement for Sherman, who had been his second in command in the Army of the Tennessee. It was more than an hour later when he retired to bed in an adjoining room to get a much-needed rest. As he arose and walked across the floor, his lameness was very perceptible. Before the company departed, he had made an appointment with Generals Thomas and Smith and several staff officers to accompany him the next day to make a personal inspection of the lines. Early on the morning of the 24th, the party set out from headquarters, and most of the day was spent in examining our lines and obtaining a view of the enemy's position. At Brown's Ferry, General Grant dismounted and went to the river's edge on foot, and made his reconnaissance of that important part of the line in full view of the enemy's pickets on the opposite bank, but singularly enough, he was not fired upon. Being informed that the general wished to see me that evening, I went into the room he was occupying at headquarters, and found 2 of his staff officers seated near him. As I entered, he gave a slight nod of the head by way of recognition, and, pointing to a chair, said rather bluntly, but